There is a particular kind of silence that exists inside loud places. Not the silence of emptiness, not the silence of a room after everyone has left. This is something different. This is the silence that lives in the exact center of chaos. The kind that only opens for a single second, in a single spot, for a single person standing at exactly the right angle. That is the silence Margaret Hollies walked into on a Tuesday morning in late October at Horse Guards Parade, Whitehall, London. Margaret was 63 years old. She had taught English literature at a secondary school in Derbyshire for 31 years. She had never been to London as a tourist. She had passed through it twice on trains, seen the tops of buildings from a window, and always told herself she would go properly one day. Her retirement gave her that day. Her daughter booked the hotel. Her granddaughter packed her a small camera and showed her how to use it. She was not a social media person. She did not have a YouTube channel. She was not looking for anything viral or shareable or remarkable. She simply wanted to see the Guards. She had taught a unit on the British monarchy every year for 3 decades and had never once stood in front of one of its living symbols. She arrived early, earlier than most tourists. The October air was sharp and the crowd was still thin when she found her spot, slightly to the left of the main viewing area, close to a stone pillar, at an angle that most visitors walked past without stopping. It was not the best spot for photographs. It was not the worst. It was simply the spot that was available, and Margaret Hollies was not the kind of woman who pushed through crowds to get somewhere better. And that is why she saw it. At 9:47 in the morning, on a Tuesday in October, a horse named Apollo began to tremble. Not violently, not in a way that made people step back or point or pull out their phones. It was a trembling that started somewhere behind the ears, moved through the neck, and settled into the front legs in a way that looked, to the untrained eye, like absolutely nothing at all. A flicker, a ripple, the kind of movement you file away without knowing you have filed it. But the guard on Apollo's back felt it immediately. And what he did next lasted no more than 3 seconds. He leaned forward barely, almost invisibly, brought his lips close to the space just behind Apollo's left ear and said something. Not loudly, not in a tone that carried, in a tone that was meant for one set of ears only, and those ears were not human. Apollo went still. Not gradually, not after a moment of continued trembling. Still. Immediately and completely still, the way water goes still after you remove the thing that was disturbing it. The crowd around Margaret continued taking photographs. A child to her left was asking his father what the tall hats were made of. 2 women behind her were debating whether the horse was real or animatronic, a conversation that Margaret found both alarming and deeply entertaining. Nobody had seen what she had seen. Nobody had been standing at that angle, at that moment, with 31 years of training themselves to notice the detail that everyone else skips. She stood very still herself for a long moment. Then she did something that surprised even her. She took out the small camera her granddaughter had packed, rewound the last 30 seconds in her mind, and wished very badly that she had pressed the button 10 seconds earlier. She had missed the whisper on camera, but she had not missed it. And what she saw in those 3 seconds would stay with her, and eventually reach the rest of the world, in a way that nobody, not Margaret, not the guard, and certainly not Apollo, could have predicted. Most people who visit London put Buckingham Palace on their list first. This is understandable. Buckingham Palace is iconic in the way that only a handful of buildings in the entire world manage to be immediately recognizable, enormously photographed, permanently lodged in the global imagination. The guards there are famous. The changing of the guard ceremony is timed, managed, and designed in part for the people watching it. Horse Guards Parade is different. It sits at the other end of St. James's Park, on Whitehall, facing a parade ground that has been used for military ceremony since the 17th century. It is older than the version of Buckingham Palace most people know. It is quieter in a way that feels earned rather than managed. The building itself, a Palladian structure completed in 1753, was once the main entrance to the Palace of Whitehall, which burned down in 1698 and left Horse Guards as one of the few surviving remnants of a royal complex that most people today have never heard of. The guards stationed here are from the Household Cavalry Mounted Regiment. This is not a ceremonial title attached to a largely administrative role. The Household Cavalry is the senior regiment of the British Army. Its mounted soldiers are drawn from two of the oldest and most distinguished regiments in the country, the Life Guards and the Blues and Royals. They have served in active conflicts. They have guarded monarchs. They have operated in environments that bear no resemblance to the cobblestones of Whitehall. When they are posted at Horse Guards, they are performing a duty that has continued, without interruption, for over 300 years. The horses they ride are not chosen for their appearance. They are chosen for their temperament, their intelligence, and their capacity to remain calm under conditions that would cause most animals to panic. The Household Cavalry's horses are sourced largely from Ireland and undergo an extensive training program that lasts well over a year before a horse is ever ridden on public duty. They are exposed to crowds, to noise, to sudden movement, to flags, to music, to children, to cameras, to everything the streets of London can throw at a living creature. And still they are horses. This is the part that the tourist brochures do not say loudly enough. These are living animals with nervous systems and instincts and thresholds. They are extraordinarily well trained. They are paired carefully with the riders who will work with them. But they are not machines and they are not statues. They feel things. They react to things. And when something in their environment crosses a threshold that training alone cannot manage, they communicate it through the body, through the ears, through the legs, in the only language available to them. The guard who rides them is trained to read that language fluently. This is not a casual skill. It is not something learned in a weekend or acquired through enthusiasm. The relationship between a Household Cavalry soldier and his horse is built across months of shared work, shared space, and shared pressure. The rider learns the horse's rhythms the way you learn the rhythms of someone you live with, not through study, but through proximity. You begin to know what a particular flicker of the ear means. You begin to know the difference between the trembling that comes from cold air and the trembling that comes from something the horse has felt in the crowd that you have not yet identified. On that Tuesday morning in October, the crowd at Horse Guards Parade was larger than usual for that hour. A school group had arrived unexpectedly early. A tour bus had dropped its passengers at the wrong end of Whitehall, and they had funneled in through the arch in a compressed, noisy wave. There were camera flashes, still common despite the signs. And there was the particular kind of crowd noise that builds when people are excited and unaware that their excitement is accumulating into something with weight and pressure. Apollo felt the weight of it before anyone thought to manage it. And the stakes in that moment were not small. A startled horse on a cobblestone parade ground, in the middle of a compressed crowd, with tourists on all sides and a stone archway at one end, is not a minor inconvenience. It is a danger, not a theoretical danger, a real and immediate one, with consequences that land on the tourists first and the guard immediately after. The guard knew this. The crowd did not. And that gap between what the guard knew and what the crowd understood is the space in which everything that mattered happened. Let us go back to 9:30 that morning, 17 minutes before Apollo trembled. The school group arrived first. 42 children between the ages of 9 and 11 from a primary school in Bristol, accompanied by 4 teachers who were managing the controlled chaos of 4 decades of combined classroom experience with the particular helplessness that comes from being responsible for 42 children in an open public space. The children were excited. They were loud in the way that children are loud when they are trying to be good, but good has a volume limit that adults forget about. They arranged themselves in a rough cluster to the right of the main viewing area. The teachers positioned themselves at the edges. The children pressed forward in small, incremental surges, not disobedient, just drawn, the way anything young and curious is drawn toward something large and still and impressive. The tour group arrived at 9:38. Approximately 30 people, a mix of nationalities, armed with phones and one enormous professional-looking camera, operated by a man in a red jacket who had clearly decided that this was going to be the definitive photographic record of Horse Guard's parade, and was treating the cobblestones like a studio floor. He moved. He crouched. He repositioned. Each repositioning brought him slightly closer to the area where he was not supposed to be. Margaret arrived at 9:41 and found her spot by the pillar. By 9:44, the space in front of Apollo had compressed in the way that crowds compress, not through any single person's decision, but through the collective drift of everyone moving slightly forward, because the person in front of them had moved slightly forward. Nobody decided to cross the line. The line simply became, for the crowd, a suggestion rather than a boundary, in the way that suggestions become when nobody enforces them for long enough. At 9:45, a child at the front of the school group, a small boy with a yellow anorak and the absolute conviction of someone who has recently been told that the horses are trained and therefore safe, took 3 steps forward and stopped only because his teacher caught his collar. The collar catch made a sound, not a loud sound, a snap of fabric and a child's surprised exhale. Apollo's ears moved. Not dramatically. They rotated the way a horse's ears rotate when something has entered their awareness, and settled in the direction of the yellow anorak. His weight shifted, almost imperceptibly, onto his back legs. His breathing changed in a way that the guard on his back registered as immediately as you register the change in a room's atmosphere when someone walks in angry. At 9:46, the man in the red jacket crouched directly in front of Apollo for his photograph, and a camera flash fired. Not his. Someone behind him. At the exact moment a bus on Whitehall released its air brakes with a sound like a sudden exhalation from something enormous. Apollo's front left leg moved, just once, just slightly, but it moved. And the trembling began. Margaret, at her pillar slightly to the left, at the angle nobody else had chosen, watched the guard's shoulders change. Not tense, that is the wrong word. Sharpen. The way attention sharpens when it narrows to a single point. His hands, which had been resting with the practiced stillness of someone who has held this position for hours, made a movement so small it was barely a movement at all. A half-inch adjustment on the reins, a shift of weight in the saddle. And then the lean forward. And then the whisper, 3 seconds. That is all it was. Margaret counted them later, not because she was timing anything, but because she found herself replaying the moment so many times in the weeks that followed that she eventually counted them the way you count the seconds of something you cannot stop watching. 1. The guard's upper body moved forward. Not dramatically. The way a person leans in to tell you something they do not want the room to hear. His chin dropped perhaps 2 inches. His lips moved toward the space behind Apollo's left ear, the place where the neck curves and the mane begins, where the skin is close to the surface and the blood runs warm, and the sound of a voice, even a quiet voice, arrives with a particular intimacy. 2. His lips moved. Whatever he said was shaped by them. Margaret could see the shape of it, the way you can see the shape of a word without hearing it, but she could not read it. She had no skill in lip reading, and the angle was not clean enough for certainty. What she could see was that it was not long. It was not a sentence. It was not an instruction in the way that commands are instructions. It was something shorter than that. Something that had been said, she understood instinctively, many times before, in many private moments, in a stable somewhere that the public never sees. 3. Apollo's ears, which had been rotating forward with the tight attention of an animal tracking a threat, moved. Not back, not the flat back signal of a frightened horse, but sideways, and then slightly down, into the position that anyone who knows horses recognizes as the posture of a horse that has just been told, in language it trusts, that everything is fine. The trembling in the front legs stopped. The weight redistributed. The breathing, and Margaret swore she could see the breathing change, though she acknowledged later that she may have been reading into it, slowed. The guard's body returned to its upright position. The whole thing was over. The crowd continued taking photographs. The man in the red jacket repositioned for another shot. The child in the yellow anorak was now asking his teacher whether the horse had a name, and the teacher was checking her clipboard to see if the information pack included this. The two women behind Margaret resumed their animatronic debate with a third opinion that the horse was definitely real because it had blinked. Nobody had seen it. Margaret stood at her pillar for a long moment. She was not a dramatic person. She did not gasp or grab anyone's arm or announce to the crowd what she had just witnessed. She simply stood and let the moment settle into her in the way that things settle into you when you have spent 31 years training yourself to pay attention. Then she pressed the button on her camera. She had missed the whisper by 10 seconds. What she captured instead was Apollo, perfectly still, ears in the position of calm, chest no longer carrying the tight compression of a startled animal, and the guard, upright again, face forward, expression unchanged, as though nothing in the world had happened or ever could. She looked at the photograph. It told you nothing about what had occurred. It looked like every other photograph taken at Horse Guard's parade that morning. A magnificent horse, a magnificent guard, a crowd of tourists with their phones out, London doing what London does. And yet, Margaret Hollies had been an English teacher for 31 years. She knew that the most important things in any story are almost never the things that are written down. They are the things that exist in the white space between the lines, in the pause before the next sentence, in the moment that the writer chose not to describe, because some things are more powerful when the reader is left to feel them rather than be told them. She put the camera in her bag. She thought about it for the rest of the day, over lunch near the Thames, on the bus back to the hotel, over dinner with her daughter, who noticed that her mother was quieter than usual but did not push, because she knew her mother's quiet the way you know the quiet of people you have loved for a long time. That night Margaret wrote about it, not for the internet, not for anyone else. She wrote about it in the small notebook she had carried in her bag every day for 11 years, the habit of a teacher who was always finding things worth keeping. She wrote 3 paragraphs, none of them dramatic, all of them precise, and then she closed the notebook and went asleep. Her granddaughter found the notebook 3 weeks later, read the 3 paragraphs, and without asking permission, which Margaret later said she would have granted anyway, typed them up and posted them. By the following morning, the post had been shared 40,000 times. The internet, when given a mystery with no clean answer, does not wait patiently for the truth. It generates its own. Margaret's 3 paragraphs spread first through a small community of royal watchers on a forum dedicated to the household cavalry, a group of people who take the subject with a seriousness that occasionally surprises those who stumble across them. From there it moved to a larger platform, picked up by a travel account with a significant following, and then it was everywhere in the way that things become everywhere now, suddenly and completely, as though they had always been there, and you had simply not noticed them until this moment. The question that everyone focused on was the same question Margaret had raised in her 2nd paragraph, quietly and without drama. What did he say? The theories arrived in waves. The first wave was the practical wave. Horse trainers weighed in with confident authority. Several of them agreed that the guard had likely used a specific calming vocalization, a low, rhythmic sound that works not through meaning but through tone and familiarity. They cited studies. They referenced the science of equine auditory processing. They were knowledgeable and credible and almost certainly partially correct, and they satisfied nobody at all, because the practical answer, while true, felt somehow too small for the moment that Margaret had described. The second wave was the military wave. A veteran who had served in a regiment adjacent to the Household Cavalry posted a lengthy and detailed account of the specific verbal commands used in mounted training. He was authoritative. He had clearly thought about it carefully. He suggested the guard had used one of 3 specific phrases drawn from the training manual, and he listed all 3. The post was shared widely. It was also immediately contradicted by another veteran, who said the training manual he was referencing had been revised in 2019, and 2 of the 3 phrases he cited were no longer standard. The 2 veterans then had a detailed and surprisingly heated exchange about equine training protocol that the rest of the internet watched with the particular joy that comes from watching 2 experts disagree about something you cannot verify. The third wave was the romantic wave, and this one had the widest reach. Someone suggested, without evidence but with great conviction, that the guard had simply said the horse's name. Softly, twice, maybe 3 times. Just the name repeated in the voice you use for someone you know very well and trust completely, which is a different voice from the one you use for anyone else, and which carries in it not information but presence, the simple fact of "I am here. I know you. You are not alone in this." This theory spread the fastest. It was shared by people who had never been to London and had no particular interest in the Household Cavalry. It was shared by people who had horses and people who had never touched one. It was shared by people who were, Margaret suspected when she eventually read the comments, not really sharing a theory about a horse at all, but sharing something about themselves, about what it means to be known by someone in the specific way that makes fear manageable. A lip reader was eventually consulted. She was a professional, used regularly by news organizations, and she was given the best available footage, not Margaret's photograph, which told nothing, but a video clip that a tourist near the arch had posted later that week, capturing the aftermath of the moment rather than the moment itself. The lip reader studied it carefully. She came back with a cautious and qualified answer. The footage was not clear enough for certainty, the angle was wrong, and she could not responsibly give a definitive reading. What she could say, with reasonable confidence, was that whatever was said was short, possibly 2 words, possibly 3, and appeared to end with a sound made at the front of the mouth rather than the back of the throat. This told everyone everything and nothing simultaneously, which is the ideal outcome if you want a mystery to stay alive. A linguist suggested it might have been a word from a language other than English. The Household Cavalry draws from a wide range of backgrounds, and it was entirely possible that the guard's private language with Apollo was not the language he used with other people. A horse behaviorist pointed out that the specific position of Apollo's ears in the aftermath suggested a response to something familiar rather than something new, which supported the idea that whatever was said had been said many times before in private. A poet, because the internet eventually involves a poet, wrote a short piece about the unknowability of the moment that was. Margaret admitted when someone sent it to her, actually rather good. Nobody knew. And the not knowing, it turned out, was the most powerful part of all. Let us step back from the theories for a moment and look at what is verifiable. The Household Cavalry Mounted Regiment trains its soldiers and horses together over a period that begins long before any public duty. When a new horse arrives, typically a 5 or 6-year-old Irish sport horse or similar breed, chosen for size, temperament, and trainability, it enters a program that acclimates it gradually to the specific pressures of ceremonial duty in a major city. Noise desensitization, crowd exposure, unusual visual stimuli. The horses are walked through busy streets, past market stalls, alongside buses. They are exposed to drums and trumpets and the compressed chaos of large public gatherings, trained to register these things and choose stillness over reaction. But the relationship with the rider runs deeper than training. The Household Cavalry takes the pairing of horse and rider seriously in a way that goes beyond practicality. A soldier assigned to a particular horse spends time with that horse beyond the requirements of duty. Grooming, feeding, the daily routines of the stable, which are unglamorous and physical and deeply relational. You cannot spend that much time with a living creature, responsible for its well-being, reading its moods and adjusting to its needs, without developing something that functions very much like a private language. It is not a language of words, primarily. It is a language of pressure and timing and tone, of when you tighten and when you release, of the specific weight shift that means something different from every other weight shift, of the sound that means safety, built up across hundreds of repetitions until it is no longer a sound at all but a certainty. The way certain words spoken in a certain voice by a certain person stop being words and become something you feel before you process them. Former household cavalry soldiers, speaking in various interviews and written accounts over the years, have described this relationship with a consistency that is striking precisely because they are not sentimental people. They do not, as a rule, reach for poetic language. They are precise and practical and trained to understate. And yet when they speak about their horses, about the specific animals they served with, some of whom they have maintained contact with long after their service ended, something in the language changes. It becomes quieter, more careful. The way language becomes when you are trying to describe something real that does not fit easily into the available words. What the guard said to Apollo that morning, we do not know. What we know is that it worked. We know that it worked not because the guard commanded the horse with the authority of a trainer managing an animal, but because the horse trusted the guard with the familiarity of a creature that has been met, consistently and privately, in its own language. There is a difference between compliance and trust, and what happened in those 3 seconds was not compliance. Apollo did not stop trembling because he was told to stop. He stopped because someone he recognized, in a voice he had heard before in calm and private moments, reminded him of who he was when the world was not loud. That is not a military technique. It is not in a training manual. It is a relationship. And relationships, by their nature, are built in the invisible hours, the ones the public never sees, the ones that have no ceremony and no audience and no function beyond the simple fact of two creatures becoming known to each other. The crowd at Horse Guards Parade that morning saw a guard on a horse. They photographed it. They will show the photographs to people they know and describe what they saw, and what they describe will be accurate: the uniform, the horse, the precision, the stillness. But the thing that actually happened that morning was not visible in any photograph. It was in 3 seconds that almost nobody caught, spoken in a voice that carried no further than one set of ears, in words that the world will probably never know, between a man and an animal who had built, in the unglamorous privacy of a stable, something strong enough to hold in the middle of a crowd. Phase 7: What it means. Margaret Hollies went back to Horse Guards Parade on her last morning in London. She did not tell her daughter where she was going. She took the small camera, left the hotel early and walked. The October air was still sharp. The tourists had not yet arrived in the numbers of the previous Tuesday. She found the same spot by the pillar at the same angle, and she stood there for 40 minutes watching. She did not see anything remarkable. The guard was still. The horse was still. The crowd that gradually gathered was respectful and quiet in the way that crowds are quiet when nothing is happening to excite them. She took no photographs. She simply stood and watched and thought, in the unhurried way she had spent 31 years trying to teach young people to think, about what the moment had meant. She wrote about it that evening in the same small notebook, and this time her granddaughter did not post it. She read it once and said nothing, and handed it back. Some things, both women understood without saying so, belonged to the person who saw them. But Margaret agreed to be interviewed, not for a television program, not for a large publication, but for a small online newsletter dedicated to the household cavalry that had reached out with unusual care and unusual patience. She spoke for about an hour. She was precise and quiet and occasionally funny, a trait that 31 years of teenagers had not so much given her as refined. She talked about the moment in the same 3-paragraph structure she had always used in her teaching when something needed to be understood rather than simply known. What she said, in the part of the interview that was shared most widely afterward, was this. She said that she had spent her career trying to teach young people the difference between authority and power. That power is loud and visible and often mistaken for authority by people who have not yet understood that the two are separate things. That real authority, the kind that actually moves people, that actually changes what happens in a room or a stable or a classroom, is almost always quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not demand recognition. It has nothing to prove because it was built, slowly and privately and without an audience, in the hours that nobody photographs. She said that what she saw in those 3 seconds was not a guard managing a horse. It was a person being trusted by something that had no reason to trust anyone, and every evolutionary reason to run, except for the specific weight of that specific voice, which had been made trustworthy, one ordinary day at a time, in a place the public never sees. She said she had been trying to teach that idea for 31 years, and she had never been able to explain it as clearly as a horse's ears had explained it on a Tuesday morning in October. The interview ended there, and the question it left, the same question Margaret had sat with in her hotel room on that first night, the same question that the lip readers and the horse trainers and the veterans and the poet had all circled around without quite reaching, is still open. What did he say? Maybe it was a command. Maybe it was a sound. Maybe it was a name, repeated softly, the way you say a name when you want someone to remember that they are known. Maybe it was something in another language, or no language at all, just the tone of a voice that had become, through repetition and presence and all the private hours of an ordinary working relationship, the sound of safety. We do not know. What we know is that it worked. What we know is that it happened in 3 seconds, in a crowd of hundreds, and that almost none of them saw it. What we know is that the most powerful things, the things that actually hold in moments of pressure, the things that actually steady what is trembling, are almost never the things that get photographed. They are built before the crowd arrives. They live in the quiet. And if you want to find them, you have to be standing at a slightly different angle from everyone else, patient enough to watch for what is not being announced, willing to see something that offers no proof of itself beyond the simple, unmistakable fact that it worked. Margaret Hollies was standing at that angle. And now, in a way she never intended and would not have planned, so are you. So tell me, have you ever witnessed a moment of quiet authority that nobody else in the room seemed to notice? A word that changed everything, spoken too softly for most people to hear. Leave it in the comments, because this story is not finished. It is only finished when the person reading it decides what it means to them. And if you want more stories about the people and animals and traditions that hold quietly, invisibly, under pressure, subscribe. There are more of them than you think. They are simply waiting for someone to stand at the right angle.